Ever feel like the legal system is one giant maze? We're tackling a listener request today, a deep dive into something many find mystifying: federal court jurisdiction. We've got two sources to help us make sense of it all.
And by the end of this, you'll have a much clearer picture of when a case can actually be heard in federal court. Because believe me, it's not always obvious.
Okay, let's unpack this. Imagine trying to sue, say, a restaurant for truly terrible service. We're talking epic meltdown levels of bad. You wouldn't head straight to federal court for that, right?
You'd be laughed right out of the courtroom. Federal courts have very specific powers, and they don't deal with every parking ticket or fender bender.
Exactly. Congress actually sets the menu, the subject matter jurisdiction, for what kinds of cases federal courts can even consider. Our first source really emphasizes that this isn't just a technicality. This is about the very foundation of our legal system, a balance of power between state and federal authority.
And that balance is carefully guarded. This isn't something you can just ignore or waive. If a federal court doesn't have the authority to hear a case, they can't make a ruling on it, period.
It's like the plaintiff, the person filing the lawsuit, needs to convince the court, hey, this case, this is totally your jurisdiction, Your Honor.
Absolutely. They need to demonstrate why their case belongs in federal court. And sometimes that hinges on who's involved in the lawsuit.
Which brings us to diversity jurisdiction, right? It sounds pretty straightforward, but this is where things get really interesting.
Think of it this way. You're from a small town, and suddenly you're facing a lawsuit from a massive corporation based in another state. You might worry about getting a fair shake in your local court, right?
Makes sense. It's like that whole home court advantage idea, but in a legal setting.
Precisely. And that's where diversity jurisdiction steps in. Our first source uses the case of Strawbridge v. Curtis to illustrate how this works. For diversity jurisdiction to kick in, there needs to be complete diversity. That means everyone on one side of the lawsuit must be from a different state than everyone on the other side. No exceptions. It's all about ensuring a neutral playing field.
Okay, I bet that gets tricky with corporations, especially with them having offices all over the place.
You're absolutely right. That's why things get even more fascinating. For corporations, it's not just about where they're incorporated, but where their primary business operations are based. The first source cites a landmark case, Hertz v. Friend, which established the nerve center test.
Nerve center? Sounds intense.
It is. It boils down to where the company's major decisions are made, where their main headquarters or brain of the operation is.
Both sources really emphasize domicile, too. It's not just about where you sleep at night, right? It's about putting down roots where you vote, where you pay taxes, that sort of thing.
Exactly. It goes deeper than just a temporary address. It's about your intent to stay in a place, your legal home. And that can get pretty complex. Courts will actually look at things like tax returns as evidence to figure out where someone's true domicile lies.
Wow, so you can't just rent an apartment in another state for a month and call yourself a resident for legal purposes. It's all about those long-term ties, legally speaking.
You got it. But sometimes it's not the parties involved that determine where a case lands. Sometimes it's BBR.
You're talking about federal question jurisdiction now, right? This is where Uncle Sam himself says, hold on, this case has my name on it.
Exactly. And that's where we'll pick things up after one.
Oh, right, we don't have breaks. So let's dive right into that then. Federal question jurisdiction. This is where it gets really interesting because we're talking about the Constitution, federal laws, treaties.
You hit the nail on the head. If the lawsuit hinges on interpreting any of those, boom, you might be headed to federal court.
Okay, so it's got to be a pretty big deal. We're not talking local noise ordinances or anything.
You're right. It can't just be a side note, some tangential issue.
Oh.
Source one uses the case of Louisville and Nashville Railroad v. Motley, a case about broken promises and lifetime train passes, to really highlight this.
Okay, now you have to tell me more lifetime train passes. This sounds like my kind of lawsuit.
Right. So back in 1871, the Motleys were injured in a train accident, and instead of suing, they struck a deal. Lifetime train passes in exchange for dropping any legal action. Everyone wins, or so they thought.
Free train travel for life, sign me up. But I'm guessing it didn't quite work out that way.
Fast forward to 1908, Congress passes a law prohibiting railroads from handing out free passes. Just like that, the Motleys' golden ticket is revoked.
Oh no, I bet they were fuming. So what'd they do?
They sued, arguing this new law didn't apply to their unique situation, that taking away their passes violated their Fifth Amendment right to property.
So they took it to federal court, claiming a constitutional issue was at play. Clever. Did it work?
Not quite. While the Supreme Court acknowledged the federal question, They ruled that the Motleys' primary claim was a breach of contract, that lifetime pass agreement, which is a state law issue.
So even though a federal question popped up, it wasn't the foundation of their case. That's fascinating.
And a crucial point about federal question jurisdiction, the federal issue must be the driving force behind the lawsuit, not just a passenger along for the ride.
This is reminding me of those legal dramas where a clever lawyer finds a way to sneak a case into federal court.
There's certainly a lot of strategic thinking involved, and sometimes it gets even more complex when a case has a mix of federal and state law issues tangled up together. That's where we wade into the waters of supplemental jurisdiction.
Okay, so picture this. A federal court is already dealing with a case, but then some state law issues rear their heads, kind of like a legal plot twist.
Exactly. Imagine a case involving, say, a car accident. You might have a personal injury claim under state law. But if that accident involved a defective part that violated a federal safety regulation, you suddenly have a federal question, too.
So now we've got a jurisdictional mashup. What happens then?
That's where things can get tricky. Source 1 calls this pendent jurisdiction. It essentially allows a federal court to handle related state law issues when they're intertwined with a federal claim that they're already dealing with.
So it's all about efficiency, right? Keeping everything in one courtroom instead of bouncing between state and federal courts.
Exactly. It's about preventing conflicting rulings and making the judicial process smoother. And believe me, it can get incredibly nuanced, especially when you factor in things like class action lawsuits, where you might have plaintiffs from multiple states with different laws at play.
My head is spinning. It seems like there's always another layer to peel back when it comes to jurisdiction. But what about the defendant in all of this, the one being sued? Do they just have to go along for the ride?
Not necessarily. Remember, our legal system is all about balance. And that brings us to the defendant's secret weapon, the power of removal.
Removal? Sounds intriguing. So, fill us in. What's that all about?
Well, think of it this way. Sometimes the defendant in a lawsuit might believe they have a better shot at a fair hearing in federal court.
Okay, so like if they're up against a hometown hero in state court, they might want to try their luck with a federal judge instead.
Exactly. And that's where removal comes in. Source 1 is very clear. Only the defendant can initiate this maneuver, shifting the case from state court to federal court.
But there are rules, right? They can't just shout, "Federal court, take the wheel," and wash their hands of the whole thing.
You got it. One of the common grounds for removal is diversity jurisdiction. That whole idea that everyone on one side of the lawsuit needs to be from a different state than those on the other side. Remember the Strawbridge case we talked about earlier?
Oh, right, where everyone had to be from a different state to avoid any hometown bias.
Precisely. But here's where it gets really interesting. Source 1 points out a key limitation. Even if you have perfect diversity, if the defendant is a resident of the state where the lawsuit was filed, they can't remove the case to federal court based on diversity.
So no fleeing to federal court just because you'd rather not have a state judge in your backyard, huh?
Nope. It's all about keeping things fair and balanced. Can't let defendants game the system just because they're a little nervous about their home turf.
I'm starting to realize how much strategy goes into choosing the right court. It's like a legal chess match. But we focus so much on federal courts, it makes you wonder, are there cases where state courts are the only option?
Absolutely. In fact, both sources pointed out an area where state courts almost always have exclusive jurisdiction, cases involving wills and estates.
Interesting. So those family inheritance battles you see on TV, those are strictly state court dramas.
Exactly. Think about it. Wills, inheritance, family dynamics, these are all very personal matters, deeply intertwined with state laws and local communities. It makes sense that those cases would stay within the state court system.
Wow. We've covered so much ground in this deep dive, from corporate nerve centers to lifetime train passes to the delicate balance of power between state and federal courts.
It's fascinating how these jurisdictional rules, which might seem dry and technical at first glance, actually shape the course of justice for real people facing real legal battles.
It really makes you appreciate the complexity and nuance of the legal system.
Absolutely. And the more we understand these rules, the better equipped we are to navigate them, whether we're facing a legal issue ourselves or just trying to make sense of the legal dramas unfolding around us.
Couldn't have said it better myself. So there you have it, a whirlwind tour through the world of federal court jurisdiction. We've just scratched the surface, but hopefully you've gained a newfound understanding of this critical legal arena.
And who knows, maybe this deep dive will spark your curiosity to explore other fascinating corners of the legal world.
And on that note, we'll leave you with this. We talked about how state courts often handle those dramatic will and estate cases, right? But what about situations where someone lives in one state but has property in another or passes away while traveling? Where does jurisdiction fall then? It's a question worth pondering and maybe even worthy of its own deep dive someday. Until then, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and we'll catch you on the next deep dive.
So before we got sidetracked by all that, you were about to explain removal. What's the deal with that?
Right, removal. Well, it's kind of like it sounds. Sometimes a defendant thinks, I might get a fairer shake in federal court, and they can actually try to shift the case over from state court.
Interesting. So it's a way for the defendant to sort of hit the reset button strategically.
Exactly. But it's not a free-for-all. Our first source points out that only the defendant gets to initiate removal. Plaintiffs stuck wherever they filed initially.
Makes sense. Can't let anyone just bounce a case around till they get the judge they want. But when would they even do that? What are the grounds? Oh, there are a few. But one we've already talked about comes up a lot. Diversity jurisdiction. Remember that whole thing where everyone on one side has to be from a different state than those on the other.
Oh, right. Keeps things neutral. Like the Strawbridge case, everyone from different states, so no home team advantage for the courts.
You got it. But here's the catch, and Source One was very specific about this. Even if you've got perfect diversity, picture this. If the defendant, the one trying to remove, if they're the resident of the state where the lawsuit started, they're out of luck.
Oh, sneaky. So no running to federal court just because you're nervous about a hometown judge.
Exactly. Keeps
Yeah.
things balanced, right? Can't have defendants gaming the system just because they're feeling a little unsure about their home turf.
This really shows how much strategy is involved in choosing the right court. It's like you need a legal playbook just to figure out where to start. Makes you wonder, are there N-wing cases where you just have to stick to state court?
Oh, absolutely. Both sources actually pointed to one area that's almost always exclusive to state courts, cases about wills and estates.
Oh, interesting. So like those family inheritance battles they always show on TV, those are state court dramas then.
Yep. Think about it, wills, inheritance, family dynamics. It's all very personal, often tied up in state laws, local communities. Makes sense to keep it at that level.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Wow, we really covered a lot today. Corporate nerve centers, lifetime train passes, that whole balance of power between state and federal courts. Who knew jurisdiction could be so tricky?
It's fascinating, isn't it? These rules might seem dry at first, but they have a huge impact on real people's lives, their access to justice.
It really makes you appreciate how complex the legal system really is.
For sure. And the more we understand these rules, the better equipped we are, right? Whether we're facing a legal issue ourselves or, hey, just trying to follow along with those legal dramas.
Couldn't agree more. So there you have it, everyone. A whirlwind tour through the world of federal court jurisdiction. We just scratched the surface, but hopefully you've got a better grasp on this key part of the law now.
And hey, maybe this even sparks some curiosity. The legal world is full of fascinating rabbit holes.
And speaking of rabbit holes, we'll leave you with this thought. We talked about how state courts often handle those dramatic will and estate cases. But what happens when someone lives in one state, owns property in another, or even passes away while traveling? Where does jurisdiction fall then end?
Yeah.
Something to ponder, and hey, maybe even worthy of its own deep dive someday. Until then, keep exploring, keep those legal brains buzzing, and we'll catch you on the next deep dive.